Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to dig into a really fascinating part of American history, the Industrial Revolution,
Okay.
or maybe more specifically, how America went from like 0 to 60 in the manufacturing world.
Mm.
And get this, some of those early success stories, well, let's just say they're a little ethically ambiguous.
It is pretty wild how often we celebrate innovation without really acknowledging how complex history really is.
It is interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've brought us a stack of articles on early American history, focusing on the rise of industry and this thing called the market revolution. So what's the mission for today's deep dive?
Well, we're going to try to figure out how the U.S., which is basically a startup at the time, managed to go up against England, who was the reigning champ of
It
manufacturing.
was like David versus Goliath, but with factories and blueprints instead of slingshots.
Yeah, exactly. And just like any good underdog story, there were some, shall we say, creative liberties taken. Take Samuel Slater, for example. He's often called the father of the American Industrial Revolution, and his story back in 1791 is pretty wild.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did he do?
Basically, he memorized the designs of British textile mills,
Wow.
which were top secret at the time.
Oh, yeah.
He brought those secrets to America, and he helped set up the very first U.S. textile factory.
Wait, so he was like an industrial spy for factories.
You got it. Industrial espionage. It was all the rage back then. England had this massive head start with manufacturing, and they definitely were not going to share their knowledge.
Right, that makes sense strategically speaking. But Slater wasn't the only one who was bending the rules a little, was he?
Oh, absolutely not. Another great example. Francis Cabot Lowell.
Okay.
This guy was an American businessman who took a little fact-finding trip to those same British mills.
Let me guess, his memory was as good as Slater's.
You could say that. Lowell totally memorized the plans for the Cartwright power loom.
Wow.
Came back to America and, yep, you guessed it, built his own version. Became incredibly successful. He basically built a textile empire on borrowed blueprints.
So much for the whole bootstraps narrative, huh?
Yeah.
I mean, was the American government in on this too?
You are not going to believe this, but they basically cheered it on.
Get out.
Oh, yeah. Alexander Hamilton,
Oh, wow.
the first Secretary of the Treasury, he was a huge advocate for, well, let's call it technology transfer.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
I always thought of Hamilton as this staunch supporter of American ingenuity and ideas.
Oh, he absolutely was all about building American industry, but he was also a total pragmatist. He knew America was playing catch-up, and he argued that getting industrial secrets from other countries was absolutely crucial.
Ah.
He even suggested rewarding people who did it.
Wow. Talk about a different time. So how did this actually play out, practically speaking?
Well, let's just say state governments were known to look the other way, even help finance the import of machinery that was, shall we say, acquired through questionable means.
Right.
And patents, they were kind of a free-for-all back then.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. The definition of an original invention was super flexible. Let's just say that sometimes patents were given for things that looked awfully similar to European designs.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that line between genuine innovation and just straight-up intellectual property theft, it was awfully blurry.
That's fascinating. It seems less like borrowing and more like straight up copying in some cases.
It really was a product of its time.
Yeah.
America was this brand new country trying to find its footing, and they saw being strong in industry as the key to their future.
Right. So how does this industrial espionage tie into the bigger economic changes happening in America? We're talking about the market revolution, right? What does that even mean?
Oh, that is where things get really interesting. The market revolution, it refers to this time of massive economic and social change in the U.S., roughly from the 1820s to the 1850s.
Okay.
Think of it like this giant wave of change just sweeping across the country.
Wow.
Westward expansion was booming. New technologies like the telegraph were suddenly everywhere. And of course, those factories, they were multiplying like crazy.
It sounds like things were changing so fast compared to life just a generation before.
Absolutely. But there's a lot of debate among historians about just how much the market revolution really changed things. Was it this sudden seismic shift, or was it more of a gradual evolution?
Okay, so tell us about this historical debate. Whose theories are we talking about here?
Well, two big names in this whole debate are Charles Sellers
Okay.
and Daniel Walker Howe.
Okay.
Sellers, he argued that the market revolution was a radical shift away from America's agrarian past, a whole new era of capitalism, for better or for worse.
Okay, and what about Howe? Did he agree with that?
Not really. How he thought the transition was much more gradual, and that for the most part, people actually benefited from this expansion of markets and cheaper goods.
So two different perspectives on the same historical period. What do you think?
I think both historians bring up some really important points. The market revolution definitely led to huge changes, some good, some bad. It just depended on who you were and what your place in society was at the time.
That makes sense. It's easy to forget. There's always more than one side to every story, especially with these major historical events. What were some of the biggest changes in that era? It seems like this is when America really started to become the America we know today.
You're absolutely right. This was a pivotal time. One of the most obvious changes was the rise of factories, like those textile mills we talked about earlier.
Right.
This created new opportunities for some, but it also gave rise to a whole new social classing, right? The working class and their lives, well, they were often very difficult.
And I'm guessing those new opportunities didn't always come with the best working conditions.
You're right. Working conditions in those early factories were often terrible. Long hours, dangerous machinery, and really low pay.
Yeah.
And if you got injured on the job,
Yeah.
that was your problem, not theirs.
Wow. It's hard to even imagine having to work in those conditions. Did workers just accept that as reality?
Not without a fight. This era saw the beginning of the labor movement in America. Workers began to organize and demand better treatment.
That's inspiring. Tell us more about those early labor movements. What were some of the big issues they were fighting for?
One of the biggest issues was just how long the workday was. Can you imagine working 12, 14, sometimes even 16 hours a day?
Oh my gosh.
6 days a week.
I can barely handle an 8-hour day.
Right. And these were really difficult, back-breaking hours. So one of the main things those early labor unions wanted was to make a 10-hour workday. And believe it or not, that was a radical idea back then.
10 hours is still a really long time. I guess it was a step in the right direction, though. Were they successful?
Well, it was a long, tough battle, and it really depended on where you were. But by the 1840s, some states, mainly in the North, started passing laws that made the workday 10 hours, at least for certain industries.
A small victory for the labor movement.
Exactly, but the fight was nowhere near over. Those early unions, they had a really tough road ahead of them.
What were some of the other challenges they had to deal with?
One of the biggest challenges was that there were constantly new immigrants coming to America. And a lot of these immigrants, they desperately needed work, and they were willing to take lower wages and worse conditions just so they could survive. And that made it really hard for unions to organize and get better treatment for workers.
Like the old saying, divide and conquer.
Sadly, yeah. And it wasn't just factory owners who opposed the new labor movement. The government and the courts often took the side of businesses.
Oh, really?
They saw unions as this threat to economic growth and stability.
So those early labor organizers were fighting an uphill battle, to say the least.
They definitely were, but despite all those challenges, they kept going. And it's so important to remember that those early struggles, those victories, even if they were small, they created the foundation for the labor movement. The same movement that would win big for workers in the future.
So we've talked about some of the hard parts of the market revolution, the exploitation, all those people being forced off their land and the struggles of the people working in those factories.
Right.
But we've also seen the start of a powerful movement for the rights of workers.
Yeah.
So as we start to wrap up this part of our conversation, what are some of the key takeaways from this part of American history? What can we learn from the market revolution that we can apply to our own time?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that progress isn't this simple straight line that always goes up. It's messy and it's complicated, and we have to really pay attention and be involved to make sure that everyone benefits, not just a select few.
So we can't just relax and think things will just work themselves out.
Exactly. We have to learn from the past and not just celebrate the good parts. The market revolution, for all the progress it brought, also left us with inequality and injustice. It's a cautionary tale about what can happen with unchecked economic growth and how important it is to consider the human cost of progress.
There's that saying, I think it goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. What rhymes or echoes of the market revolution can you see happening now?
You know, one of the most interesting parallels is how technology affects things. Just like the steam engine, the cotton gin, and the telegraph completely changed society in the 1800s, new technologies today, artificial intelligence, automation, the internet, they're all reshaping our world. And just like back then, these advancements come with amazing opportunities, but also with huge challenges.
It's crazy when you really think about it. We are living through a technological revolution that's probably just as big as the Industrial Revolution, and just like back then, some people benefit more than others, and it often makes the gap between the rich and poor even wider.
You're exactly right. And one of the biggest challenges we have now is making sure that everyone benefits fairly from this technological progress. The market revolution saw wealth ending up in the hands of just a few people. And we're seeing that happen again today with the gap between the rich and the poor getting wider and wider. The market revolution, it was kind of like shaking up a snow globe.
Yes.
You know, it totally changed the way people live their lives. It shifted like whole social structures around, and it even sparked new ways of thinking. Like one of the biggest changes was this idea of individualism that started to emerge.
Interesting.
So you had people moving away from those family farms and those really close-knit communities to find work, whether in the factories or out west, and those traditional sports systems, they started to like weaken.
So less dependence on family and community, and more emphasis on what each person could accomplish on their own.
Exactly. This was when that whole idea of the self-made man took off the idea that no matter where you came from, you could be successful if you just worked hard enough.
It's a nice idea, but it seems kind of simplistic, you know? It's not like everyone had the same opportunities back then either.
You're totally right. Things weren't fair and equal back then. Even though there were more opportunities, not everyone had the same chances to get ahead, like race, gender, your social class, all those things played a role. And the reality was a lot of people got left behind in this rush for success.
It's interesting how this period in American history still feels relevant today. We still see that tension between wanting the latest technology and the problems it can cause. The gap between the rich and the poor seems to be getting bigger, and the fight for social justice continues. It's like we're still dealing with the consequences of that time period.
And just like back then, it's usually the people who are already struggling the most who end up paying the price for these big, fast changes.
A lot to think about there. But before we get too sidetracked by what's happening today, let's go back to the market revolution. We've talked about factories, but there was also this massive movement of people going west at the same time, right? Did that play a role in all of this?
Totally. It's like you could even say that westward expansion was a huge part of what drove the market revolution in the first place.
Okay.
Remember those new technologies we were talking about? Like the railroads and the telegraph? Well, they weren't just connecting the cities that already existed. They were opening up all this new land out west.
Right.
So people could settle there. And this is the important part. Businesses could sell things there.
So it's about making the existing markets bigger and creating brand new ones at the same time.
Exactly. The more land that opened up in the West, the more people needed stuff. Tools, clothes, furniture, everything.
Makes sense.
And where was all that stuff being made? You guessed it, in those new factories back east.
Wow.
It was like this big cycle of growth and expansion. People wanted land and new markets, and that's what fueled it all.
And if I'm remembering my history correctly, moving west wasn't exactly peaceful, was it? I mean, that's when the Indian Removal Act happened, right?
Sadly, you're right. Forcing Native American tribes off their land, that's a really dark part of the story that a lot of people don't know about. It just shows how some people's idea of progress and prosperity caused terrible suffering for others.
It's a difficult and really sad chapter in American history. It seems like the market revolution was this mix of good things, innovation and progress, and really bad things like exploitation and people being driven from their homes.
That's a good way to put it. It touched every part of American life and created huge changes that we're still dealing with today.
Speaking of changes, we've talked a lot about how the market revolution changed the economy and society, but what about the human cost? It was a time of huge upheaval, especially for working people. What was daily life like for them?
One of the most drastic changes was just in the way work itself was done. The shift to factories and working for wages, it created a whole new set of challenges.
And I'm guessing factory owners weren't always too sympathetic to those challenges.
Not really. The conditions in a lot of those factories, they were just awful.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Long hours, dangerous machines, and you barely made any money.
Oh, wow.
And if you got hurt on the job,
Yeah.
tough luck.
It's hard to imagine people putting up with those conditions. Did they ever fight back? Or did they just accept it?
They fought back. That's when the labor movement in America really got started. Workers started forming groups, unions, and demanding to be treated better.
That's pretty amazing when you think about it. What were some of the main things those first labor movements were fighting for?
Well, for one thing, the workday was just ridiculously long. Can you imagine working 12 hours a day?
It's hard enough getting through an 8-hour day.
I know, right? And we're not even talking about easy work here. These were physically demanding jobs. So those early unions, one of their big goals was to get the workday down to just 10 hours.
10 hours is still a long time,
Yeah.
but I guess it was a start. Were they able to make that happen?
It took a long time, and it wasn't easy, and it really depended on where you were in the country. But by the 1840s, some states, mostly in the North, started making laws that said the workday could only be 10 hours long, at least in some industries.
Wow, that was a huge victory for the labor movement.
It was. But the fight was far from over. Those unions had a lot of obstacles to overcome.
What else do they have to deal with?
One of the biggest problems was that new immigrants were coming to America all the time.
Right.
And they really needed jobs. They were willing to work for less money and in worse conditions than the people who were already here because for them, it was still better than where they came from.
Right.
It made it really hard to get everyone to work together and fight for better conditions when there were always people willing to take whatever job they could get.
The old divide and conquer strategy.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just factory owners who were against them here. The government and the courts usually took the side of businesses.
Oh, really?
They saw unions as a threat, like they were going to ruin the economy.
So those early labor organizers were really up against it.
For sure. But even with all that, they kept fighting. And it's because of them that things started to change. Those early struggles, even the small victories, they built the foundation for the whole labor movement. The same movement that would eventually win big for workers' rights.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the market revolution and what it means for us today. Until next time, keep asking questions and stay curious.